This week, I want to discuss the process of retiring one shape in the search for something new so that the pot more closely aligns with my aesthetic. And the pot in question is this medium shallow bowl. I've been making this forever. It's thrown from 1 pound of stoneware clay with curving walls and a tool foot, but over the past 2 years, it's increasingly felt out of place within my body of work. This was my first attempt at replacing it. The piece is still thrown curved, but the exterior is trimmed to be more angular, yet there's still something which doesn't quite work with me. Maybe it's the band of exposed clay around the bottom of the foot, which is something only the bowls I make exhibit, so I want to see if I can try and resolve that. And this, what I'm about to show you, is my very first attempt at that. It of course hasn't been fired yet, but this prototype shows the rough shape I'm after, although I think I want a taller foot to make the bowl stand more elegantly aloft. The foot itself is straight, and I hope to glaze these right close to the bottom as well, so less raw clay is visible once fired. And of course, whilst remaining angular on the outside, they'll be thrown with a curved interior, which functionally makes them much easier to use. I'm going to be making a larger batch with taller feet from approximately 530 grams, which means I'm using about 77 more than my previous bowls, but much of that material will be left in the base to give the pot height, and I'll trim much of that away thereafter once the pot is turned leather hard. As for its thrown measurements, it's taller than the previous bowl, but slightly narrower, but I think I'm really going to enjoy the focus on getting the curve right on the insides of these, and especially finishing the tall feet these will have. Here's a quick comparison between a thrown version that hasn't been turned and a trimmed version on the right, just to give you an idea of how these pots will change as the clay is carved away from them. And a cross section too may help to visualize this even better, as it will show you where I purposefully leave the pot thicker in order for it to be trimmed to match what's in my mind's eye. I'll focus on keeping the walls even towards the top, and I'll leave the base to be about 2 centimeters thick. This way there should be plenty of material to work with. Not only that, but the excess clay in the base will make it easier to lift the pot away once thrown and wired through, as it doesn't matter if I leave any indentations in the clay, as they'll simply be removed during the turning stage further down the line. And it means these pots don't have to be thrown on bats, which saves me a bit of time, but more importantly, space. I'm using a high iron stoneware clay which is leaning towards the firm side, and I'll be weighing out each lump to approximately 530 grams. I don't mind if it's a touch over or under, as this makes weighing out and measuring the clay faster. Each piece is then wedged up in a spiralling motion to bring together all the individual bits of clay that were amassed to get to the correct weight. This process also removes any pockets of air from the clay and helps to even out the texture, so there are no hard lumps or regions of softer clay. I want them to be completely homogeneous. The clay is then placed on a plastic sheet, this way they don't develop a hard shell as they sit waiting to be thrown. Prior to filming this, I'd already thrown 2 boards of these, which means my throwing gauge's pointer is already set. This is my target in space to aim for as I pull the walls of the bowl up. It means I'm not constantly having to pick up and put down a ruler to measure the pot. Instead, I simply throw until the rim is just beside the pointer and level with it, and I'll be guaranteed it will be the correct size. I scrape my hands off against the sharp plastic edge of a bucket. This removes slip, which would make picking it off much harder, as slip is slippery, and I wouldn't be able to get a firm grip on the pot with wet hands. It's for that same reason that I scrape away a portion of the bottom of the pot before lifting it off, as by creating a sort of dry surface, it means again that there's less for my fingers to stick onto. The clay is thrown into the middle of the wheel and centered. I push equally from the side and the top to keep it confined in this puck shape, which I gently maneuver until it feels like it's spinning around evenly beneath my hands. I then flick down the throwing gauge's pointer, create a hollow in the middle with about 2 centimeters of clay left in the base, and then I immediately begin pulling the walls up, making sure to keep my hands nice and wet, as well as the walls of the pot too. I pinch and draw the walls up, and at the top of each pull I spend a moment compressing the rim to make sure it's spinning around evenly. For my next pull, I press a wetted knuckle into the base, pushing some of the excess thick clay from the bottom into the walls, which I can then pull up. With these two pulls, I've actually thrown higher than the pointer, so from now on, I'll begin stretching the walls out, which causes the rim to drop in height. And with the rim now spinning in the perfect spot, I shift my focus to making sure the curve on the inside of the pot is perfect. I then use a sponge to soak up any excess water inside, and then I use a sharp, curved metal kidney and push it into the spinning clay. And really, I use the shape of the tool like a template. This way the curve of each bowl is more or less identical. I then scrape away some slip from the outside of the shape and make sure the angle the rim concludes is correct. I then scrape away the skirt of excess clay from around the base, creating the dry area I spoke about previously, which makes picking the pot off the wheel easier. I lift the throwing gauge's pointer out the way and then slide a sharp, twisted metal wire beneath the pot. This serrated stuff creates a wider cut and one that's less likely to stick back together, which some very smooth wires can. I make my own wire tools from components bought from Bath Potters suppliers, and I'll leave a link to these in the description below. This way I can make them to whatever size I want, and at a much cheaper cost. These twisted metal wires can be bent out of shape rather easily. They can even snap too, eventually, so being able to assemble them myself is really useful. I then scrape my hands clean of slip, and then lightly press my fingertips into that dry section I created, and then lift and spin the wheel in the same moment. The spin helps to break any sticky seal there might be, but that can be made worse if you drag excess water and slip underneath the pot. So it's best to avoid that if you can, if you want to pick pots off the wheel like this. As you lift, it helps to keep your hands level, and I try my best to not touch any portion of the walls and the rim, as those are much weaker parts of the pot compared to the thick base, which, as it's so solid, can withstand being picked up without the shape of the vessel distorting. There is a method to my Ware board placement. I like to be able to slide them backwards and forwards. This way I can always move my Ware boards to an appropriate position to make lifting the pots onto them easiest. This way I'm not holding a bowl and stretching really far over to place it. Instead I just progressively move the board upward so I can place it directly to my right. Fundamentally these are quite simple and easy pots to throw, which is good in a way, as the trimming of them is a bit more complex and definitely more time consuming. Now thrown, I'll let these bowls sit out overnight in order to dry out to leather hard. Throughout much of the rest of the year, if I leave thrown pots uncovered, by morning they're often too dry to work with, but in the winter it's almost perfect, and many of these bowls were in the right condition to trim straight away, which is rare. But for those that aren't, I flip them onto their rims in order for the thicker bases to dry out more quickly. Yet, like mentioned earlier, I've already thrown a batch of these, which have been sitting wrapped up in plastic, and they're the ideal state of leather hard to trim. So I'll begin with these, of course. As I trim, I'll keep this example in front of me. This way I have a reference to follow, so I know what to aim for, although the newer versions will have slightly taller feet. As this is the first ever sizable batch of these bowls I've made, it was relatively slow going to trim them, like it always is when learning a new shape. Each bowl is attached to the wheel with some slip, which I brush onto the metal and then place the pot onto. The piece is tap centered and then sealed around the base, and then I give the inside a quick skim over with a metal kidney, just to make sure the interior curve is perfect, and to remove any of the more prominent throwing rings, if there are any. I also bevel the rim so it comes to a sharper point. This way the edge of the pot will be finer, and a viewer's perception of the piece will be that it's lighter and more delicate, which are qualities I want in the work I produce. I can press the rim with my fingertips, just to soften any sharpness, and then the bowl is sliced off the wheel head. I make sure the metal is clean before placing the bowl upside down and tap centering it back into the middle. I then place a spinner on top, through which I'm going to be pushing down to pin the bowl onto the wheel. I do this as I want to trim the bowl very close to the rim, and if this portion was held in place with lumps of clay or anything like that, then I simply wouldn't have access to it, so I have to keep it pinned down from above like this. The first step in the shaping of the bowl is to flatten this top portion, changing it from slightly curved to mostly straight. With this portion turned, I can set about trimming the underside of the bowl, and to lock the pot in place, I press 3 lumps of soft clay around the rim. And there is a technique to this. I place the clay next to the pot and then push them directly down. If instead I place the clay next to the rim and then pushed it towards the bowl, like so, this could deform the rim of the pot as it's pushed harshly against it. Whereas when pushed downward, I let the clay that squashes out be the material that holds the bowl in place. The spinner can then be removed, and with a pair of calipers and a potter's needle, I measure out a circle that's 5.6 centimeters across. This marks the outermost portion of my foot ring, and from this point I can begin really removing clay and separate the bowl's outer surface into the 3 distinct planes. There's going to be the straight foot, and then the 2 planes that make up the outside curve of the bowl. With so much mass being removed from this portion of the foot, you may ask yourself, why don't you just throw them with a narrower base? First of all, it's easier to throw them very quickly if there's a bit more mass in them. Secondly, having a bit more clay in the base helps to support the overhanging walls. Not that they overhang very much, but if thrown to a width like this, you may notice the inside shape beginning to slump occasionally. And lastly, like mentioned a number of times now, the extra clay makes lifting it off the wheel easier, and means there'll be less distortion. And with each of the 3 planes finished on the outside, I can begin work on what's arguably the hardest part about making this new shape, and that's trimming the foot. I begin by flattening the top, and then burnish the outer edge with the smooth side of a plastic kidney. I then bevel the sharp edge just a touch, which will make it less prone to being chipped, and then stamp the pot at this point with my maker's mark. If instead I waited to do this at the very end of the process, like I normally do, then the simple act of stamping the clay would easily distort the very fine foot, whereas if done now there's still plenty of material left to support it. It also works as a guide of sorts, as it clearly indicates where I need to stop trimming. Otherwise this turning is slow and careful. It's so incredibly easy for the tool to catch and for it to dig away more clay than I'd like, especially from the sides. I grip the turning tool very securely and shave the clay away layer by layer. The last thing I want to do is try and remove too much in any one go, as there comes a point where I can't even really see what I'm doing. So I take my time and I periodically check the thickness of the base by gently pushing down on it with my thumb. If it gives or if there's any movement, I know I absolutely have to stop turning. But at the same time it can be tricky with such a deep foot ring, as inevitably the clay inside is going to be softer, so I almost have to work more carefully the deeper I go. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with giving the foot a quick blast with the heat gun just to stiffen the clay up. And that's the first bowl finished. I love the tool foot. It makes the bowl feel elegant and slightly sculptural, and they already feel as if they fit into the rest of my family of work. It's always fun weighing a piece before and after it's been turned, and I feel like the difference will be quite dramatic with these. So here's an unturned piece, coming in at 452 grams. And here's the bowl I just trimmed, which comes in at 224, which is just about half the weight, which is crazy. Who knows, going forward I may need to leave a bit more weight in them to survive the firing process. But I won't find that out until sometime next year. After a few hours turning these, my speed definitely improved, but I've also figured out that I need to make a new maker's mark that's even smaller than the one I'm currently using, as really it's that which is limiting the width of my foot, and I would like to trim these to be a bit finer. I have to say, it does feel a bit strange retiring a shape. It's not something I've ever really done before, but it feels like I'm doing the right thing, as I'm really excited about making these, whereas those previous bowls I just wasn't. I've made so many of them over the years, and I think as the other pots I've been making have developed character, they've sort of just remained the same, whereas these feel fresh and exciting and angular and sharp, whilst keeping the very best quality of the curved bowl, which was the curved interior, as it's that which really allowed the glaze to pool into it. Side by side there's a huge difference. I prefer the taller shape. I think functionally it's a bit more useful, and the tool foot will help keep the contents warmer for longer. Although before I can make any real changes, I first have to fire some of these and then use them at home. And with those turned, I can move on to finishing all the rest. I check whether the clay is at the right condition to trim by rubbing my fingers over them like this. If the clay on the base sticks to my fingers, then they're still too soft to turn. But if my fingers glide over the clay with very little friction, then I know they're good to go. And if I feel like waiting pots are getting too dry, I'll wrap them up in plastic to halt the drying process. I'd love to hear about what you think. Does this bowl feel more Florian Gadsby to you? And what do you think about retiring old forms, which you may not find exciting to produce anymore? I can't wait to see how these footwells look once coated in glaze. And perhaps my only apprehension with this new shape is how the glaze flows down the outer surface, as this new style of foot doesn't have a glaze catch like my previous bowls did. But as long as I don't glaze them too thickly or overfire them, then that shouldn't be an issue. Thanks, as always, for taking the time to watch. It honestly means such a lot, and I hope you've enjoyed this look into seeing how I develop new pots. And I'll see you, as always, next time.